we will head to our next speaker. Wendy Yared is a Miami-based food anthropologist. She founded Evolve.ag to help people better understand where their food comes from. Evolve.ag features long-form content, podcasts, social media, and events that look at how new food technologies have the potential to shape culture and change people's lives. In her spare time, Wendy likes to garden and practice yoga. So for a talk on the future of food, please welcome Wendy Yared to Texylvania.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Oops, 1 second. Yeah. Okay. That's so weird that it's not full screen. Let me do one more thing. Okay, there we go. All right, so hi, everybody. My name is Wendy Yared, and I'm a food anthropologist and the founder of Evolve.ag, which, like Trevor said, is an educational platform where I host podcasts, online events, and a blog about the future of food. Today, I'm going to share some incredible technologies with you that have the potential to ensure that we're all eating the diets that we want, getting the nourishment that we need, and contributing to a greener planet. Oops, 1 second. Okay. All right, so take a minute and think about what you ate for dinner last night. Did you plan out your dinner beforehand at the grocery store, or perhaps you went to a local restaurant? Was there anticipation building as you were cooking or looking over the menu? Was there anything that you remember about the meal? Can you remember the scent? Can you remember the taste of the food? Well, food is one of the most visceral and enjoyable parts of life, and it's life sustaining too. It differs based on where you are in the world, and just the smell of it sometimes has the power to evoke feelings and emotions and nostalgia. But what if suddenly one day you couldn't walk into the grocery store and get your favorite food? What if your local restaurant could no longer get the ingredients to make your favorite dishes? Well, as we saw from COVID, especially at the beginning of last year, this is quite easy. It's quite easy for this to happen, for food supply chains to be stressed or disrupted, especially by societal or political or even cultural actions, thus running out of your favorites, not to mention essentials like milk or meat. And it's not because we don't have enough food. So between 1960 and 2015, across the world, agricultural production more than tripled. And this resulted in an abundance of low cost fare and averting global food shortages. So while this was a super positive thing because there were less people starving, the food being grown and sold at low prices was not always the healthiest. So you have fewer hungry people, but they're malnourished and not necessarily getting good nutrition. For example, current rates of obesity are higher than they've ever been. And to top it all off, at least in the US, it's estimated that we waste up to 40% of the food that we produce. So, how do we fix this? How do we make sure that food is sustainable, it's affordable, reliable, nutritious, and at the same time not ruining our planet? Well, I'm going to walk you through some high tech innovations related to food and why we need them in the three main categories of diet, so plant based, pescatarian, and meat eaters. So I'll start with plant based because I'd imagine most of the audience here eats at least some fruits and vegetables. Plant based diets are trending these days, and for a lot of reasons. They're usually lower in cholesterol and saturated fats. If you're vegan, there are just a million recipes out there that creatively substitute in dairy and meat products to make the perfect replica of old favorites, but plant based. And there's even a ton of pre-made packaged goods that mimic the real thing, like the Impossible Burger, we've got vegan cheese, and even egg substitutes made from flax or mung beans. Now, while these innovations make it really easy to swap out the meat for the vegetables, there's still a lot of issues with how we grow the vegetables. So I'm sure by now you've heard that traditional farming in the US uses herbicides and pesticides, and these stay on your produce after they're picked. They also run off into the waterways, they pollute our bodies, and they harm the environment too. Pollinators are also suffering. In a lot of cases, beehives are trucked from one location to another, and then instead of being able to set up in one spot, they're forced to pollinate just one type of crop for a limited amount of time. And this moving and shaking and pollination of just one thing often leads to disease, it leads to parasites and stressed out colonies. So think about your life when you do a lot of business travel, right? It's tiring, your immune system tends to degrade, and then you're stuck doing the same thing over and over again. It's just not pleasant. Also, the foundation of all agriculture is soil health. Now, most farmers supplement their crops with some kind of fertilizer because, especially with monocropping, the soil tends to degrade over time, especially when it's used for like the same crops over and over again. And most crops take up nutrients from the soil. So, unless you're planting a cover crop that puts the nutrients back in, it's easy for soils to not contain enough minerals or nitrogen or other things that the plants need to grow big. So farmers add things like minerals or nitrogen or other, nutrients that the plants need to grow big. When large fields are harvested and then replanted, the existing root systems that are there that are full of precious microbes from the seasons prior are disturbed and in a lot of cases destroyed on purpose because the farmers want to, get into the soil. They want to make sure there's not a lot of weeds or anything like that. And this destruction of the soil really reduces the quality of it. Poor soil without root systems can cause the temperature of soils to fluctuate. It holds less water for plants and increases the chance of mudslides and a lot of other things. Okay, but let's say the harvest is great, everything is happy, the fruits and vegetables are being picked off the plants and off the trees. A large number of them never even reach the consumer. And one reason for this is appearance, right? Plants in the wild don't uniformly grow. And in a lot of cases, when plants don't look just right, they don't make the cut to go to the market. Or if they have a little couple bugs or they have a little mildew on them, which are actually common problems, especially if you're growing organic. I'm sure some of you know if you've had a garden during the past couple of years, it's hard to keep the bugs off. So those plants don't make the cut either. And then there's the food miles to get to market. So in America, most of our leafy greens are grown in Salinas, California, and at least some of them need to make the trip to the East Coast, which by car, if you're speeding and you're not sleeping and you're just going straight across the country to Norfolk, Virginia, takes 43 hours. And a lot can happen in a week on the road, right? Jostling around leads to bruises and damage, mold, spoilage. It's really hard being a fruit or a vegetable. And it's even harder to be a farmer or a truck driver, right? There's a lot of peril between seed and plate for everybody involved. And you certainly don't see rich farmers very often either, right? But everybody has to eat, and fruits and vegetables provide important nutrients. So here we are. Now, I've just given you a bunch of bad news. Sorry. We talked about bee colony collapse, degrading soil quality, mudslides. And this is how I used to view the world of agriculture, right? We're feeding ourselves to death. Our planet's going, to death. And I was very, very pessimistic. But then something happened that changed my perspective completely. About 10 years ago, a professor at Columbia University named Dixon DePalmier wrote a book about vertical farming. He was inspired by these so-called plant factories in Japan that were just starting to become a thing. Back then, I read his book and I was like, wow, thank God, this technology is going to save the world. And flash forward 10 years and voila, I mean, there is a vertical farm in almost every country in the world. Here in America, we've got a bunch of them like Gotham Greens, Bowery, and Square Roots, just to name a few. These happen to be based in the Northeast. In the Middle East, there's a barrage of farms growing in the desert, which is really great, and even farms being built in malls there, because everything's in a mall in the Middle East. Not everything, but if you've been there, they love their malls. In Romania in 2019, there was a partnership between Microgreens Romania and grocery retailer Metro Cash and Carry, and these put a vertical farm inside a grocery store in Bucharest. So they're really popping up everywhere, which is really cool. But what is a vertical farm? Vertical farms are controlled environment, indoor agriculture systems that usually grow plants, yep, you guessed it, vertically. They typically use LED lights that mimic the sun, and most systems utilize hydroponics to deliver water and nutrients to the root system. In these controlled environments, the sky is literally the limit. Right now, most vertical farms grow leafy greens, they grow sprouts, and other foods that don't require a lot of attention or pollination. But the industry is really quickly expanding to tubers, to root vegetables, and even flowering plants. In China, they're experimenting with grains like rice, and recently even found a cultivar that yields twice as much rice in a vertical, twice as fast in a vertical farm than rice grown out in a field. And they're getting creative when it comes to pollination too. So some are using real bees, and others are trying out new technologies like polybee, which is essentially a small autonomous drone that pollinates plants. And if you're interested in learning more about drone pollination, here's a shameless self plug, but I'm dropping a new podcast next week with the founder of polybee. So be sure to subscribe to the Evolve.ag newsletter on Evolve.ag so you can be the first to hear when it's released. Okay, back to vertical farming. So the benefits of vertical farming are enormous. They can use up to 95% less water than traditional farming methods because the water is being recirculated in the system. There's even another technology called aeroponics that sprays the roots with water at certain intervals instead of using that steady stream of water. And these systems are said to use up to 98% less water than traditional farming. In vertical farming, the environment is closed to the elements, so pesticides are not necessary because pests just simply aren't allowed in. And if there's a bad storm or high winds, the plants are not affected, which is really helpful for areas of the world where climate change is impacting farming. So, for example, these pictures are of my friend Ralph and his vertical farm in Manila called Urban Greens. Now, Manila is constantly being hit with floods, with monsoons, hurricanes, you name it, weather-wise, they get it. But he doesn't care. They have a backup power for their farm, and they have so much demand for produce that they're expanding into a giant warehouse. Case in point, vertical farms can be built in the middle of cities, so food miles are dramatically reduced, and areas known for food insecurity can also be served more easily. Food is fresher because it's picked just hours sometimes before it's consumed or put on shelves, so it's full of nutrients, it's full of crispiness, and tends to last longer. It has not taken a cross-country drive to get to you. Food safety is thus far not an issue with vertical farms because cleanliness is another one of those factors that they closely monitor. Farm workers are not stuck outside in blazing hot weather or breathing in harmful pesticides and herbicides. And sorry, Bayer, there's no glyphosate here. Another huge benefit of growing up instead of out is land savings. It's estimated that a vertical farm can reduce the amount of land needed to farm by 98%. The Vertical Farm Institute states that every square meter of floor space of vertical farming produces approximately the same amount of vegetable crops as 50 square meters of conventionally worked farmland. And the CEO of Brick Street Farms in St. Petersburg, Florida, was just quoted as saying they're producing an estimated 20 acres of farmland in a 1/3 acre lot. Now, new technologies always have their challenges, and vertical farming is no exception to that. Because vertical farms use LEDs to mimic the sun, energy costs can be quite high. But with the right design, like in this photo right here, alternative energy sources, and the increasing efficiency of LEDs, this is eventually, I think, going to be a moot point. Price point of the produce is another huge critique, with recent articles asking if vertical farms are just for the wealthy. Now, the industry knows price is a huge barrier to entry, especially when it comes to consumer choice. And this is going to be solved when vertical farm companies can operate at scale and implement more automation. Because vertical farming is a blossoming industry, if you will, CapEx expenditures are really high, and there's still just a ton of R&D involved. But every vertical farm company I've spoken to has this issue at the top of their list and a roadmap to get there. Granted, the roadmaps might take 3 to 5 years. But trust me, the industry wants their food to be accessible and at a comparable price above all else. Most founders that I've talked to got into this industry because they wanted to solve food security and save the world, not because they thought it would bring them overnight riches or success. They know price parity is the only way this industry is going to thrive. And like I said, it's really just a matter of scale and automation above all else. Vertical farming is the stuff that futuristic building renderings full of green vegetables like this one and happy inhabitants eating salad bars grown on location are made of. And they're happening in real life. In Japan, you can get a salad at your office building that was grown on site. In London, vertical farmers have taken over abandoned tube stops to grow produce. Vertical farming is just an incredible technology that we're only going to see grow exponentially in the next few years as climate change makes traditional field-based farming a little bit more challenging. Okay, so I covered the future of food for the vegans out there. What about the rest of you who eat fish and meat? Well, let's start with fish. So fish farming is another sad and kind of scary industry. You've probably seen or heard of some of the documentaries and books that have been written as of late that talk about the horrors of the fishing industry. Overfishing is totally an issue. As you can see from this chart, the UN FAO estimates that about 23% of fish stocks are either overexploited or depleted, and I bet some of your favorites are on that list. And more than half of the fish stocks in the world are dangerously heading in that direction too. Mislabeling a fish is another issue, which basically means that you might not be getting what you pay for. In a lot of places, the labeling of fish is not highly regulated, so there's mistakes that are made. And while the factory farming of fish keeps populations in check, a lot of them are grown in these big pens in the wild, and these often negatively impact the surrounding environment. For example, penned fish have been found to have elevated levels of parasites, viruses, and bacterial infections. This often leads to fish keepers pumping them with antibiotics, which then also goes out into the environment as well. And these large pens tend to contain a concentrated amount of fish excrement because the fish are all living in one place instead of migrating around like they usually would. This inevitably pollutes the environment nearby and creates unsavory conditions for the neighboring fish that are not in the pens. And then there's issues with bycatch, there's humanitarian issues, there's all different types of things linked to workers' conditions on fishing boats, but it's really not a positive story. And I wanted this to be a positive talk. But if you want to read a little bit more about this, I highly recommend the book, The Secret Life of Groceries by Benjamin Lohr. I had a fireside chat with him earlier this year on Evolve.ag. And as an anthropologist, I can definitely vouch for his research approach to this topic and storytelling ability. So check that out if you want to learn a little bit more. Okay, so I just mentioned a bunch of issues with fish, and my goal was not to change your mind about what you choose to eat, just to make you a little bit more aware of what's going on in the industry, and of course, share what new technologies are out there that will fix this. So there's a couple that I want to highlight. The first is land-based aquaculture or fish farming. This is basically growing fish in big tanks on land instead of in giant pens in the water. Similar to vertical farming, the environment is controlled and there's very little use of antibiotics, if at all. A lot of these farms have incorporated hydroponics too and plants into their system. This is called aquaponics. Aquaponics is a closed system of fish farming where the fish are grown in large tanks, and then usually the fish water, if you will, water that the fish live in, grow in, and poop in, is recycled in the system. And the nutrients are processed usually by helpful bacteria. So that way the fish get the right amount of nutrients and not the wrong amount of nutrients, and they get the right nutrients, not the wrong nutrients. So it's all very controlled and closed loop. Now, these pictures are from an aquaponic farm in the outskirts of Berlin that I met with a couple years ago called ECF Farms. They're growing tilapia and perch, and then herbs that you can buy locally in Berlin. I just learned actually that they opened up their fourth farm this May, and it's actually on site at a grocery store in Wiesbaden. So if you happen to be visiting there, check that out. It's definitely some of the freshest fish and herbs that you can get in Germany. Now, another innovation in growing fish is actually not an innovation at all, and it's not really just for fish. It can be used for livestock like chicken and pigs too. This is insects. Now, this might sound kind of obvious, but fish and chicken and other animals eat insects in the wild. But when these animals are grown in large factory environments for food, insects are usually not part of their diets. Instead, they're fed diets that are designed to fatten them up as quickly as possible. Fish tend to eat a lot of pellets made of fish bycatch. Chicken and pork feed usually contain chicken and pig parts. It could contain sawdust, they could contain feathers, and other unsavory ingredients. In the US, at least, the livestock feed is really not highly regulated. And while some of you might squirm to the thought of large-scale insect farms, this new technology is doing exactly that. They're growing insects at scale to feed our food supply chain because while we're starting to become more aware of what we eat, we're not too concerned about what the food that we're eating is eating, unless it's like a grass-fed cow or a chestnut-fed pig for Spanish charcuterie. And what's really cool about a lot of these insect farms, I think, is that they're feeding the insects with food waste. And then the insect farm itself is a closed loop system. So here's how it works. Basically, they get food waste from local grocery stores, restaurants, or municipalities, depending on the laws that govern food waste. And let me tell you, there's a lot of really weird laws that govern food waste. They typically feed the food waste to insect larvae, and the larvae are just voracious eaters. So they eat and eat and eat. They turn into adult insects. Some of them are allowed to reproduce, and then they die. The dead insects are turned into feed. The byproducts, like the shells and the insect poop, or frass as they call it in the industry, can be used for agricultural purposes like fertilizer or soil enhancer. And then the cycle starts back over again. So it's really an incredible system because they're utilizing food waste and it's all kind of contained. So this diagram is from Insect with a Y. They're a insect company out of France. And if you notice, they also put humans and pets on here as potential eaters of the insects. Insect protein is a great source of protein and a potential substitute for meat. Now, I personally think the US and most of Europe are still a ways out from eating insects in a daily meal or even, feeding it to our pets. But I could see the athletes or paleo folks or folks who subscribe to some kind of protein heavy diet becoming early adopters of this. And, the pet food industry is evolving too. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Insects are definitely not for everybody, but they are a great and a natural way to feed livestock and fish and potentially humans and pets. Okay, so I covered vertical farming, land-based aquaculture, aquaponics, and insects. Meat is next. Oh, wow, meat. Where did we go wrong? While delicious, it has got its flaws. So according to the UN Environmental Group, between 1970 and 2011, so sorry, this data is a little old, but still makes the point, livestock production increased from 7.3 billion units to 24.2 billion units worldwide, with about 60% of all agricultural land being used for grazing. Agriculture, to some extent, has become less about actually producing food and more about generating animal feed, which is one more vote for those insect farms. And then, there's the farting cows who, unbeknownst to them, are being accused of contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and creating holes in the ozone layer. In fact, a new study came out just this month in Nature that stated global greenhouse gas emissions from animal-based foods are twice those of plant-based foods, which is where I pulled this chart from. And then, there's the animal rights side of things. I'm not going to lecture you because I eat meat too. And there are plenty of animal rights groups out there to Google if you want to get a good idea of what's going on there. But let's just say that the vegans are onto something because there's a lot of inhumane practices with the factory farming of animals. In my country, at least in the US, livestock farmers have efficiency down to a science. Typically, they fatten up the pigs and the chickens to a desired weight, and there's just no wiggle room. There's no wiggle room on the timing of slaughter. The animals have to be killed before they get any bigger, otherwise they can't be sold or walk or see their toes if they have them. It's pretty bad. And growing livestock requires huge amounts of water, food, and land. But like I said, there is a solution, and this one is probably the most futuristic of all the technologies I've mentioned thus far. It's cellular agriculture. Now, cell-based meat and cell-based dairy is coming. And to be clear, this is real meat and real dairy. The same meat you're used to eating, the same dairy you're used to drinking, not tofu meat, not soy milk meat, real meat. But it's made from the cells of an animal instead of slaughtering an animal. And for reference, it's also referred to as clean meat, cultured meat, lab-grown meat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for this talk, I'll just keep calling it cellular agriculture or cell ag. Basically what happens, as you can kind of see from this diagram, is that scientists take stem cells from animals without causing any crazy detriment to the animal. And they put the cells in a nutrient-rich solution and then grow them in a pressure cooker-like apparatus. In order to get the right, let's say, cut of meat, they grow the cells in what's called a scaffold, which is usually made up of some kind of plant material and mimics the 3D environment that the cell would be grown in the animal. So if you're looking to grow filet mignon or meat from a lobster tail, for example, the cells would be grown in a scaffold that mimics the animal's features in that part of their body. Now, I borrowed this image from Shiok Meats. They are a cell ag company out of Singapore working on cell-based crustaceans. And in my opinion, they've always done a really good job of clearly explaining what the process looks like. This is not their first infographic. There's a lot of technical terms when it comes to researching the cellular agriculture industry, but I think the best way to encourage adoption of this new technology is creating materials like this. Straightforward infographics that compare the process of growing meat in a lab to something we're all kind of familiar with, at least somewhat. Now, because the meat is grown in a lab instead of on an animal, there's no need for antibiotics or hormones. Similar to vertical farming, there's an enormous amount of land savings involved, and it's much cleaner, safer, and not exploitative. Again, there are greater energy costs associated with growing meat in a controlled environment, but here we have yet another opportunity to use alternative energy sources. And I have no doubt that in the process of growing meat in a lab and perfecting that technology, the innovations are also going to occur in how energy is created as well. Similar to other technologies, price parity with traditional meat is top of mind for all the producers I've spoken with. And again, once CapEx is invested and they can operate at scale, cell ag producers believe the price of their meat will be comparable to the price of meat in grocery stores today. So keep an eye out. Cell ag might be on our plates very, very soon. And in fact, the USDA is in talks right now about how to name it. If you saw the headlines maybe last December in Singapore, cellular agriculture was approved for human consumption, and a company called Eat Just served cell-based chicken nuggets, the ones that were on the previous slide. The former Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, made headlines a couple months ago when he tried cell-based steak by an Israeli company called Aleph Farms, and he stated that he just couldn't tell the difference because there isn't any. And there's plenty of seafood coming out too. So if you're in the US, keep an eye out for Wild Type, who is making sashimi grade salmon. Or if you're in Asia, there's Shiok Meats, like I mentioned before. If you are in the Middle East, just keep an eye out in Israel because it is an absolute powerhouse right now when it comes to cell-based meats. There's a test kitchen for chicken and multiple companies besides Aleph growing cell-based meat and really innovating the industry there. In the EU actually allocated over 2.7 million euros to support research and development of cellular agriculture. And the Netherlands has Meatable, which is working on beef and pork. Spain has a company called Ethica Meats, and they're even tailoring their products to be low fat. For dairy, keep an eye out for Turtle Tree Labs. They're making milk. And I'll end with a really crazy one. Check out BioMilk. They're making human breast milk in a lab. The list goes on and on. Things get weirder and weirder, and the industry is really, really booming. So besides price, the other critique of cellular agriculture is the solution that the cells grow in. Now, at the beginning of the cellular agriculture revolution, like last year, a lot of companies were using fetal bovine serum. I'm going to repeat that, fetal bovine serum to feed the growing cells. Now, this sounds gross, and it's obviously a big turnoff for anybody who might want to eat this type of meat because they're looking to cause less harm to animals. However, the industry figured this out pretty fast, and a lot of companies have switched to a plant-based or even mushroom-based serum to feed the cells. Again, most founders got into this industry because they want to cause less harm to animals, not more. So fetal bovine serum really didn't make a lot of sense. So keep an eye out for cellular agriculture approval in your country and in grocery stores soon. It's really just a wild world out there when it comes to food. The future is here, and I think these technologies, vertical farming, aquaculture, aquaponics, insect farming, and cellular agriculture will really be the change that the global food systems need to survive and thrive, or at least be the beginning of the change, right? If you want to learn more about innovative food technologies, please follow me on LinkedIn, subscribe to the Evolve.ag newsletter on the site, and follow the Evolve.ag social of your choice. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any burning questions or want to talk further. Thanks.
Hey, Wendy, thank you so much for that. I wanted to say briefly before you leave, if you have the time, there are a lot of questions for you down in the chat, which I think you'll be able to navigate right when we get out of here. Unfortunately, we have to move on to our next speaker, but I did want to let you know that there are a lot of questions for you down there if you have the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll check them out. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.